I organised, 2004, I organised the first ever national conference on forced marriage. And the reason I did that was very straightforward. I used to enjoy the fact that I would be picking subjects that nobody else wanted to talk about. And so I did the first conference on airport crime, for example. I did the first conference on sports crime. I remember when I did that conference, actually, I was talking about how the behaviour of players on the pitch impacts on the spectators and ultimately on society more widely. And I'm sure you'll agree that's probably true. But I got so much hate mail. I remember one particular letter: "Dear Mr. Afzal, we English invented football, please go back to Wogland." And I looked at my globe and I couldn't find Wogland anywhere. But what I did find was his name and address on the letter. And he got a little bit of a visit from the Metropolitan Police. But it's important to remember that that's what you're up against. You're up against people who will try and hijack an agenda. In the same, this issue of honour-related crime, as in child sexual abuse, as in any other type of area that I've been involved in, has been hijacked by people. So when we talk about child sexual abuse, for example, he's currently in prison, but Tommy Robinson and people of his ilk have decided that that's an issue in which they can drive a wedge between us. And they will do so, and they continue to do so day in, day out. They're not interested, I'll be blunt with you, they're not interested in the victims. They're interested in the consequences to them and their society. And he's the first person there at any terror attack. He beats the emergency services. It's not about saving people's lives, it's about trying to make political capital out of it. And so the same thing will happen to honour-related crime. So I organised this conference in 2004. Again, it was a subject I didn't know anything about, really. People make assumptions, don't they? They look at the colour of your skin and think, well, it must have impacted on you in your life. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been married 3 times. My first wife was Irish Catholic. My second wife was Hindu, and my third and current and present future wife is Sikh. I've done my bit for multi-faith engagement, right? But nobody forced me to get married. Nobody told me that I should go down a certain route and behave in a certain way. I was allowed to do what I wanted to do. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about when people don't have choices, and what it is that you as an individual, we as organizations can do to support them in their choices. So when I organized this conference, we had some phenomenal speakers. Some of them you will know now, but in the main, they were NGOs. As I'm sure you will appreciate, NGOs have been working in this field tirelessly for decades and decades and decades. And they do so, as I think Roxanne just hinted at, with a view to not knowing whether they've got a job on the 1st of April of next year. The fact is, we know that, well, money is tight, but we don't even appreciate and recognize what NGOs do, and how important it is that we need to consolidate and support those people who are doing this work. So all these NGOs were telling us their stories, and it's stories at the end of the day that make this alive. I'm a strong believer in what academia brings, but having been surrounded by a lot of academics, I prefer to listen to other people's stories. It's about how you bring something alive. And so when people were telling me that this was something happening within their community, when they were telling me that it was happening within their families, I didn't understand it, didn't appreciate it. And like most of my conferences, I just assumed that I would be able to walk away and let somebody else do the work. But back in 2004, that single day, I did 31 national/international television interviews. The world was interested in this subject. They were going, how exotic is this issue of forced marriage happening? It doesn't happen, does it, anywhere else in the world? And I said, no, it does. And then there were people who wanted to take credit for it. I remember the French member of the French government, or the Italian government, said to me, we invented honour, it's something that we've had since Roman times. I thought, okay. And then somebody from the French embassy contacted me and said, it's just like, I can't do a French accent for toffee, by the way, so I won't emulate it. But the idea of dueling, you to protect your honour, but I said, no, you both have a gun when you duel. This is not the same thing. Okay. But the point is that people wanted to acknowledge it, but they were all saying it was somehow exotic or understated or exaggerated. They didn't really appreciate what it was they were dealing with, neither did I. So one of the things that struck me after that conference in 2004 was, well, what do we do differently? And the NGO said to me, Nazir, firstly, 2 things. One is there are no men talking about this subject, so can you? Number 2, can you use your influence across government to get some kind of governmental response. And I said, I'll try. And what I did was I went to the Home Office and I went to the MOJ and the Health Department, Education, and said, can we all have a group of senior leaders around a table and look at this issue? And we started doing that. And policing as well. One of the things we didn't have was data. We had none. So as an academic, you'll appreciate, unless you have evidence and data, you may as well give up. And so I spoke to the Metropolitan Police and said, look, there's a lovely woman there at the time called Laura Richards. And I said, could you get your analyst to look at cases? And literally, it was going through cases by hand to see what the motivations were for these types of crimes. And they then came up with a figure in 2005-06 that at that time, in that year, 12 people were killed in the name of honor in this country. And we'd never had that figure before. And we thought, 12, that's a lot. And we didn't appreciate either this issue of exporting for murder. But even if they don't happen here, they can be taken abroad and killed. But anyway, now we had a figure which meant that I could then go to government and say, do you know how much an investigation costs? How much to investigate a homicide and prosecute it? It costs £1 million each, right? So that's ultimately £12 million a year that's expended on those 12 homicides. Then you've got all the other types of honor-related crime that aren't homicide, thankfully. You know, GBHs, ABHs, false imprisonments, kidnappings, sexual offences. So this is a sizable, sometimes, I'm sorry to say this, sometimes the legal case, the emotional case, the moral case ain't enough. The business case is how you deliver what it is you want to bring a change. And so I had to do that, try and deliver the business case for doing so. And that comes relevant in a minute. So we organised this group and we sat around the tables and I'll be honest with you, I had a separate stakeholder group where the NGOs were sat, but that was like pulling teeth. Those of you who work in NGOs know that you're in a competitive environment, often for funding. So the fact that when you were in the room, or they were in the room with senior leaders from government, it looked to me as if they were fighting each other. It took us a year to define honor-related crime because there was so much backward and forward. So we had a separate group of stakeholder management, but as leaders in public service, we decided to work on our own. And we decided to think, what could we do differently? One of the things that occurred to us that we needed to look at the law. Why did we need to look at the law? Because there were clearly cases falling between the gaps. So we looked at how we could bring that about and how we could change that. And so some of that was the 2007 Forced Marriage Protection Act, Civil Protection Act, which was, as you probably remember, was a private member's bill. It was brought by a group of people, and the government at that time didn't support it. And it was the reason, it was very straightforward why I didn't support it. It costs money. So sometimes people think, oh, let's get a law in. But the reality is it was going to cost £2 million a year to train judges and lawyers and prosecutors, etc. And the government weren't prepared to fund that. So we had a conversation with the then Prime Minister, somebody you might remember called Tony Blair, I don't know if you remember. I put this to him exactly as I just said to you. If we were able to reduce the number of homicides by 2, that would pay for it, wouldn't it? And he saw that. He recognised that, and the government then adopted the bill, and it became law. And you know what's the impact that's had. In the 10 years since, hundreds and hundreds of people have benefited from having protection orders in place. You now have FGM protection orders, you will have other types of protection orders, all of which have been possible because government finally accepted that they had a role to play in dealing with this issue. I go back now to Heshe Jonas because that was the first time I came across the issue, and we as an organisation did as well. And she was a 16-year-old girl in West London, and she had fallen in love with somebody. She was from a Kurdish background, heritage, although she was born and brought up here. And because she was in love, and I go back to, I don't know why I asked for the power of love, but there you go, it makes sense. There were so many harms committed by people who claim to love you the most. Yeah? And they don't. They want to control you the most. But in Heshe's case, she wasn't allowed to have a relationship. And father found out, well, he didn't remonstrate, he killed her. There's no remonstration, straight to death and straight to execution. And the thing about Heshe's case was, again, it's probably widely known now, but the only reason Dad found out about her relationship was because a teacher rang up Dad and said, your daughter is, her attendance isn't very good. Is it anything to do with her boyfriend? Well, there you go. Question. I don't blame, nobody blames the teacher. That is what we have to deal with. We have to deal with people who you have to understand how sensitive that kind of information may be in a particular environment. That teacher didn't. Heshu's dead. But when Heshu was, when her father was prosecuted, a number of things happened. Firstly, he was convicted of her murder. But secondly, the judge said, I understand what it must feel like for you as a dad to have an uncontrollable child. And as a result, I'm going to set a minimum tariff of 12 years. Not 20 years, not 25 years. I'm reducing the sentence because of what you did, because of what you must have experienced as a father in those circumstances. Well, the good news is that is the last time that happened, because we realize, and I'm sure you do too, that actually that issue of abuse of trust, who else is there to protect her but her father? And therefore, actually, rather than it being a mitigating circumstance, it should be an aggravating circumstance. You should get longer in prison rather than less time in prison. But that's what we learned from Heshu's case. So Heshu went through the system, the case went through the system, dealt with, we had the new guidelines set up, but then we thought, how do we improve the service? And that was simple. It was simple for me. I decided to take control of them all and ensure that all of them were shared with me anywhere in the country. And so, I made sure that I think that's one of the things we have to do around leadership, is that sometimes in the early days, it's not about lacking trust in people, it's about ensuring that they can share with you and share good practice. That's what the network will do. It's about sharing information. All of that was possible because they were now telling me what was going on. So, Samara and Nazir, for example, a lot of people make assumptions. One of the ones that's often made is that these are really poor, uneducated people that do this to their families. In Samara's case, her family were extremely wealthy. They owned large parts of West London. Samara herself had been to university. She now had a recruitment company business. She was really successful. But her failure in the eyes of her family was that she fell in love with an asylum seeker. Now, it wasn't to do with religion. Nothing. Let me make this abundantly clear from the outset. Religion is not the driver here. Religion tells you, for example, that forced marriage is not a marriage. But nonetheless, they were using whatever tools they had or whatever mechanisms they had to tell her that she could not be in that relationship. And one of the bits of learning, again, from that particular case, which amazingly Channel 4 filmed throughout the trial but never broadcast. That's a subject that I will get to the bottom of at some point. But nonetheless, in that particular case, when she was taken by her mother to her boyfriend at 10 a.m. that April morning in 2006. And the mother said to her boyfriend, please wash your hands of her. Please don't love her anymore. And she said, and he said, no, we love each other. 2 hours later, she was stabbed 18 times in the presence of 2 of her infant nieces who were splattered with her blood. 2 hours later. That's escalation. That's not you saying, come back tomorrow, our expert will be in the office tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. If you are not geared up as an organization to access or provide support access in real time, you are part of the problem. Anyway, she was murdered. Then, those of you who are from police will realize we had what Italians call the omerta. The idea of silence, the code of silence. People do not talk to each other, do not ever mention this issue. And so we had to authorize the police to use the techniques that I would use in tackling organized crime. So that's listening devices, that's surveillance, all of that stuff. Which, hang on a minute, this is a domestic murder. No, it's not. It's an organized crime, and treat it as an organized crime. And as a result of that, we were able to build a case against her brother, her father, and her 16-year-old cousin. 16-year-old cousin was the one that actually did the act, but the others colluded in it. Now, there's a reason for that. They often use the youngest member of the family because of the sentencing possibilities. It'll be much lighter to dealt with, less to lose, etc., etc. But by bringing a case and recognizing this was a conspiracy, that was quite a telling moment. It was probably the first time we ever did it. Certainly the first time I ever did it. And we brought that case, and we successfully prosecuted cousin, brother. Father would have been prosecuted, but whilst the jury were out, he died of a heart attack. So God got him before me. But we made sure that not only did we prosecute the case, Roxanne, we used, I think you had press up there earlier on, we used the media. Because it was important to tell people what we'd done. Because that's how you deter. There's no point in working in a little silo and doing your bit if you're not actually changing behaviors. So telling people, we'll get you. And we will go to all these lawful extremes to get you. So stop it. That's essential. That's important. And we did that in that case. But lots of learning from that case. I mentioned earlier on about the escalation, the speed with which things happen unless you deal with it. But the more I looked at, you're a psychologist, the more I looked at Azhar Nazir, who's a brother, everything and everybody told us how loving the two of them were. He loved his sister more than he loved life itself. Yet for this issue, the fact that she had fallen in love with somebody that might impact on them materially, that's what it came down to, or the shame they would have by having an asylum seeker in their home. Because of this, he was prepared to join in to her murder. I couldn't work that out. I still cannot work that out. And I think, Rachel, when you and others, when you're looking at the perpetrator mindset, we'll find out what is it that makes you go from absolutely adoring someone to being party to their death within 2 hours. I don't get that. I don't understand it, but it was necessary to say that. And of course, that's something we have to recognize and understand. And so that was that case. We then brought the law in, and then of course, perhaps the most celebrated case, celebrated is not the right word, but most well-known case. Well, there's so many well-known cases. Shafila Ahmed, for example, I just mentioned it in passing, because next week, and it's timely, isn't it, 14th of July is a national day for memorial for victims of honor killing. We've only had that now. This is our third year. And that was, again, a grassroots campaign to organize a day, because the families won't remember them, therefore we should. As a group, as a society, we should remember them. And I mean, we went into partnership with Cosmopolitan to get that national day, the magazine. I remember the front page. Nazir Afzal wants this day 50 ways to please your lover. I never could share that front page with any member of my family, but nonetheless, that day is up there. Next Saturday is the 14th of July. And we chose that day because that's Shafila's birthday. Shafila would now be in her 30s and a qualified lawyer. That's the direction of travel she was going in. But she was taken from us. And she was taken from us by a family who saw, I don't know if you saw Judge Rinder recently, he did Judge Rinder's crime stories, not the other thing, where he did Shafila Ahmed's case. And I was involved in that. And you will see how much of a challenge it was to bring her parents to justice for that. And how they abused the community in order to defend them. They made sure and tried to make sure that everybody knew that I suppose their best form of defense is attack, and that's what they chose to do. Attack everything. They attacked the press conference where the police were trying to find their daughter. This is what they were up to. This is what we're dealing with. But at the end of the day, Shafilia's case is a good example of where in this country we don't have a statute of limitation. So it took us 10 years. Eventually somebody will speak. And there was a brave sister, actually, who spoke about what had happened, and we were able then to convict her parents. So it takes time, but you need to do it. The case I was going to talk about was Banaz Mahmood. Again, if you've got your YouTube videos and you want to link to it, there is a documentary about this called Banaz: A Love Story. And it was made by a brilliant woman called Dia Khan, who's a friend of mine from Norway. And she made this documentary which won the International Emmy. So, it's a really good piece of work. And it's there on YouTube if you want to look at it. And it's Banaz's story. Now, Banaz's story started, she's an Iraqi Kurdish girl, and family were, and she was forced into marriage at 16, and for 2 years she tolerated this marriage, but she was beaten black and blue. And so her family reluctantly, and I mean reluctantly, took her home. But then the control was even greater than it was before she was married. She was not allowed to do anything, not allowed to go anywhere. But poor Bernaz fell in love. She fell in love with this young man. This young man, she was seen kissing outside of a tube station in South London. That was the kiss of death, because some busybody from within the community saw that and went round to her father and uncles and said, "We saw your daughter kissing somebody outside of a tube station." Now, if somebody came to me and told me that about my daughter, he'd have got short shrift. But no, father, uncle decided, we're going to hold a council. So 8 men sat around a table, not unlike this one, that evening, and decided Bernaz must die. No chit-chat. Don't do it again. Bernaz must die because she's brought shame on us. And that's ridiculous. That's London, 2006-7. Anyway, so be it. They then decided that she should die. And then the group of men kidnapped her from the streets of London. They took her to wherever they were going to harm her. One of them raped her before strangling her. And we later learned, because we used covert techniques from the prison cell, he raped her so she would know who was in charge. The last thing that happened to her was her rape, and then she was suffocated and strangled. And then 100 miles later, they buried her in a suitcase up in Birmingham, under a fridge in a back garden. And it goes to show 2 things. One is, who do you think reported her missing? Not her family. How are you going to know? How do the authorities get to know these things unless we pool information, unless we share information? But we had a brave young man, her boyfriend, who said she's been gone for a few days. I don't know what's happened. This is what might have happened. And we then discovered some more things. We discovered, for example, you'll see this in documentary, that the police knew that she was under threat. Because on a previous occasion, a few days prior to her death, they had plied her with alcohol. She didn't drink alcohol. They plied her with alcohol. She'd managed to smash herself out of a bathroom window, run down the street, approached a police officer, bleeding from the hand and smelling of drink, and the officer threatened to arrest her for drunken disorderly behavior. Then she was subsequently interviewed, and this is, again is in the documentary because the police interviews are in the documentary. She was then interviewed by police about what had been happening to her, the controlling behavior. And at the end of that interview, there's a really telling moment where she says to the officer, "So what happens now?" And the officer says, "We'll get back to you." Well, they didn't, and she's dead. And so we had to, relatively straightforward prosecution of the people using covert police investigation techniques of a number of people. But we realized 2 of them had fled to Iraq. They'd gone off to Iraq, and this is post-Saddam. So we had to arrange for their extradition, and there had never been an extradition of anybody from Iraq ever. But we managed to get those 2 men extradited. And why is that? Because we as a government said to the Iraqi government, this is important to us. We don't have an extradition treaty with you, but this is important to us. And why? Because we heard on the intelligence that they were going around villages saying how proud they were of having restored the honor of their families. Wow. It was really important for us to get those 2 guys back, and we got them back. And we tried them, and they were convicted. And so right now, there are 6 men in prison, 5 of them for life, for the murder of an 18-year-old girl who fell in love and kissed her boyfriend outside of a tube station. What? Well, that's what we have to deal with. But it meant that things had to change. So police had to work differently. So we then introduced the first ever national, ACPO at the time, the police chiefs decided that it should be national guidance, so there's consistency everywhere on how you tackle this issue, and it was developed with NGOs who knew the subject. That was a real plus. We then realized that we need specialist prosecutors. We need specialist police officers. I spent hours and hours talking to educational welfare officers, to social services, you name it. You need to up your game too. You need to have some guidance and guidelines that you apply across the board, and that's what we had to do. And so we spent the best part of 2007, 8, 9, I would imagine, whilst I'm also prosecuting 100,000 cases a year, by the way, but we had to do that, raising awareness. We had to change how people behave, how people work in this field, how they share information. Every serious case review ever starts with recommendation 1, information wasn't shared. Everyone, of every type of SCR. That's why it's important to have systems in place that enable you to share that information. That's why it's important that you have systems in your organization. So even if you are, I don't know, the person on security at this building, that they know if somebody turns up saying, I'm about to be forced into marriage or whatever, that they have somebody within the organization who's in charge of safeguarding that can provide them with real-time help. It's no excuse to say, come back tomorrow. I've told you, do not say, come back tomorrow. You only have one chance. And very often these young girls, and they are boy victims, but the young girls, they've never been to a building of authority. So they'll go to the first big building they see, and it might well be the university. So what are you going to do at that level to ensure that you have systems in place to tackle that? That's a conversation that's ongoing, and we started that process back in 2008-9. But then we looked at what else is going on here. You know, does a criminal law need to change? But no, we didn't. We tried to extend the law as best we could. So Sajda Bibi was a young woman who was murdered in Leeds, not far from here. And she'd been brought to this country, it's not Sajda Bibi, but Sajda anyway. She was brought to this country and into an arranged marriage. She seemed to be happy at first. But her family, her mother-in-law, her husband, others, really made her life hell. And eventually, they killed her. And so, whilst I could have prosecuted, and I did prosecute, her husband for her murder, what about the responsibility of the family with whom she was living? And so we have a bit of legislation, which we'd never used at that time for this type of scenario, where if a child dies in the care of a parent, you prosecute the parent for not doing enough to protect their child. And so we said, hang on a minute, that doesn't say just child, does it? Vulnerable person. Surely she would not be able to speak the language, etc., not knowing anybody. She was vulnerable. And so we used that bit of legislation, and we were able to prosecute successfully her father and her mother. But, you know, we're literally making it up as we're going along. And then we decided, hang on, we need to do something more. So the then Home Secretary, whom I think you know is somebody called Theresa May, decided that, spoke to me and others about whether or not we need to criminalize forced marriage itself. Now, forced marriage is just the beginning of someone suffering. It's like an earthquake, because then there's a tsunami of domestic abuse, violence, homicide, suicide, murder. South Asian women, the research last I saw from Roehampton University, are 3 times more likely to kill themselves than British white women, because of this issue of shame, because of this issue of honor. And that's what we have to deal with. So we looked at whether or not we needed to change the law, and I spoke to the Home Secretary at the time. I said to her, look, on balance, I think you can, and you should. And they did. And that was about ensuring that, again, sometimes the law is about messages. We've only had, I think, 3 successful prosecutions under the new legislation, but it has sent out a message that you can't do this and continue to do this. Otherwise, they will feel that they can, and they act with impunity. And you had the international up there, Roxanne. You know, we realized that people were being exported for murder. So Sergia Atwell was a customs officer at Heathrow Airport, and she wanted a divorce from her husband. And mother-in-law and husband, nah, can't have that. Let's invite you to this wedding in India that we have to go to. Never saw her again. And we know from, again, intelligence sometimes work, we know that she was murdered there and thrown into a river. But that's not enough to have intelligence. What about justice? And so it took a long time, the best part of 10 years, before eventually a member of her family was able to be coaxed, supported, so they could speak about what had happened to her. And Clive Driscoll was the officer in the case. You probably heard of Clive Driscoll. He did Stephen Lawrence as well. Clive was going back and forth to India because you had to carry out, we never found her body, to carry out inquiries over there. And I remember on one occasion he interviewed in India the suspect who we imagined or believed her uncle had killed her. And then after the interview, the officers the Indian officers who were with him said, let's go for dinner. And he went for dinner and realized the suspect was there at the dinner. That's what we're up against, okay? It's not as straightforward as you think it is. But eventually we were able to bring Surjit some justice. And I know, Rachel, you work with perpetrators, but I used to go around prisons quite a bit. I went to Holloway Prison when it was open, and her mother-in-law, Surjit's mother-in-law, is now a resident, or was a resident of Holloway Prison. And I was doing a talk to prisoners, and she made it very clear in language that you don't want to understand, I don't want me to repeat, why she wouldn't talk to me. So the idea that there's remorse, the idea that they accept what they've done was wrong is nonsense. Actually, for them, it's a badge of honor as to what they've done and how they've been able to achieve what they've been able to achieve. And the youngest victim of an honor killing in this country was 9 years old. Poor Alicia will never know why she died. Again, it was in Birmingham. Her older brother was in a relationship with a girl from another family. The two families, Montagues and Capulets, didn't get on. That's Romeo and Juliet, by the way. And then one of the other family decided to set fire to her house. 10 members of the family were in the house. 9 of them escaped. Poor Alicia burned to death in a wardrobe in which she was hiding. Wow, what? Because of love. Because there was a relationship going on. 10 people could have been killed. A 9-year-old was killed. It just begs, the idea that sometimes we apply rational thinking to the irrational. We can't. That's why I always ask people to leave their prejudices out the side of the door. Don't make assumptions in this area. Don't assume they're of a certain race or a certain religion or a certain group of people or certain wealth or material backgrounds that they will be safer. I did the same thing with CSA, the assumption that all groomers are Asian men. When in fact, 80% of paedophiles in this country are British white men, means that young victims are confused. Do I go with this white man or do I go with this Asian man? Everybody tells me not to go with this Asian man. That's what assumptions are about, and that's why assumptions are bad. It's evidence that leads you and should lead you in your discussions on this subject. And we've learnt tons from the cases. You mentioned international again. Years and years ago, 7 years ago, 5 years ago, the US State Department said, Nazir, we like what you're doing in the UK on this issue of forced marriage and honour. In fact, we like it so much, can you come and tell us what you're doing? And I said, what, the Americans think that somebody's better than them? Shocking. So I went over there a couple of times to the US State Department, and yes, they were keen on developing a forced marriage unit, keen on developing legislation, federal and state, and they are doing it, but it's based on our model. And they said to me, Nazir, do you know, we've done some desk research, there's nobody in the world that's prosecuted more honor killings than you. I said, me? Yep, nobody more than you. I said, well, that's shocking. It's scary. But nonetheless, a recognition by them that we can learn internationally, that we can share stuff, that they don't have to replicate and duplicate, they can bring about the change themselves. And so we've been working, well, I had been working, and I'm sure others do now, with other jurisdictions, whether it's South Asia, Middle East, Eastern Europe. And again, don't make assumptions about where they come from. I think the last 2 cases I prosecuted when I left before I left the Crown Prosecution Service, one was Eastern European family, very strong Catholic backgrounds. The second was an Irish Catholic background. She was 16, she was pregnant. Family said to her, your child will burn in hell, etc., unless you burn in hell. It occurs everywhere and anywhere where there are rigid systems and where families have very traditional approaches, and we've got to look at them. When I talked in 2012, I did an interview with the then independent newspaper, still online I think. I talked about, what about the traveller community? I've been watching, what's that, Big Fat Gypsy, whatever it was? And I thought, well, it should actually be called My Big Fat Gypsy Forced Marriage. And they thought, oh God. And I did that article, and I kid you not, I got more death threats from doing that article than I had done from prosecuting terrorists in the mid-2000s. It's not a problem. It's always men, though, men from the traveller community. It's not our problem. Don't you dare even talk about it being our problem. Well, that tells me everything I need to know about it being a problem. So don't, be courageous. And I think, again, a network gives you the ability to have that support, because it's a very lonely tradition. After the Rothschild case, the far right came for me in an enormous way. They decided that I damaged their narrative. Their narrative, of course, being that all British Pakistani men are the same. You didn't see this in the film, because the film stops at a certain point. That all British Pakistani men are the same. And so when they discovered that I was the one that brought the prosecution, so they just created fake news. Lots of fake news and Facebook sites saying that I was the one that didn't prosecute these guys. And their followers came for me. I had an English Defence League demonstration outside of my home. I had to have a panic alarm placed in my house. I had to have police officers outside my door for the best part of 2 weeks from GMP. My kids had to go to school by taxi for 6 weeks. I got 17,000 emails in a week calling for me to be sacked and deported. I was born in Birmingham. I don't want to go back there. Right? They were determined to destroy me because I destroyed their narrative. The only way I survived, there's a great R word that's not up there, is resilience. Resilience. Yes, I had my own. I ended up on an Al-Qaeda death list in 2006-07. I've survived Al-Qaeda. I think I can survive Tommy Robinson. But the point is that resilience is a personal thing, but also resilience comes from networks. Resilience comes from having people around you that can support you. And there were so many at that time, from the police, from prosecution, from just generally people I knew who wanted to protect me from all that was happening. I pay tribute to them, I always do and always will. And that's why this network is so important. It's not just about sharing information, it's about giving you support when you go into challenging areas, when you make difficult decisions. They can attack me for all the decisions I've taken, but not for who I am. And that's where hate comes in. Hate is learned behavior, ladies and gentlemen. You only learn hate. When you're 2, I think the only thing you hate is broccoli. You learn hate, so you can also learn love. You can learn to be tolerant of each other, you can learn to support each other. And the victims of these types of crime are on their own. They are really isolated. You made the phrase isolation up there. Not just a professional isolation. Victims are so isolated. The idea that, just come and seek help. Nonsense. The moment they seek help, the threat level to them has increased. If you thought that you were bringing shame to my family by doing what you did, by telling other people about it, what do you think is going to happen then? So you have to recognize that we've got to make it as easy as possible for victims and survivors to seek help. But we've also got to do the preventative work. Now, people ask me about pretty much every area of criminality. What's the answer? If I knew the answer, I'd be a very rich man. But part of it is education. A large part of it is education. That if we can work with educationalists here, it's too late, I would say, in the university. I remember a 21-year-old young man who'd been to university in this country, born and brought up here, who said to me, Nazir, you don't get it, he said, man is a piece of gold. He said, woman is a piece of silk. I thought, that sounds nice. And then he said, if you drop a piece of gold in mud, you can wipe it clean. If you drop a piece of silk in mud, it's stained forever. Uh-oh. That is his attitude to women. That's born and educated here. So it's too late when they're 21. It's too late when they're in high school. It's primary school. It's kindergarten. It's as early as possible where you need to have these conversations about gender equality, about protections, about safeguarding, all of those types, age appropriate, about relationship education. I remember an imam at a particular mosque in Glasgow saying he's going to do sex education in his mosque now. I think, good luck with that. But relationship education, yes. Relationship education is the key. People realizing that the person who loves you, if it hurts, it ain't love. The person who loves you will not hurt you. They're controlling you. And that kind of conversation needs to be had as early as it's possible to have it. But we have challenges there. We have two in particular. We have a society now that is the sat-nav generation. It only goes where it is told. The sign says go that way, I have to go that way. So how do you get your messages across to people who have to be guided everywhere they go. That's number one. Number two, we have the Spotify generation. You know that the only thing they listen to is what they choose to put on their playlist. So how do you get your message across to people like that? And you've got to be clever here. So we've been very active over the last decade or more in using TV, media, radio, anything and every fora in order to be able to, and medium, in order to be able to get the messages across to people. I had a conversation several years ago, good luck with this, with the airlines, because I think when people are flying over and they've got that, they're stuck in a room, they're stuck in a chair, and they've got a little screen in front of them, couldn't we have a couple of adverts in there about domestic violence services and abuse services? And the airlines kept saying to me, well, that would be discriminatory if we only chose South Asian Airline or Middle Eastern Airlines. I said, no. You're just simply accepting and acknowledging that disproportionately certain communities are impacted by this. And domestic abuse actually happens everywhere. So why not have a little between your little movie, you were able to see a little video about what support services are available to you. Let's be cleverer about how we get our messages across. My son, my youngest son, got a leaflet recently when he was walking through the street, and he said, "Dad, what's this?" And we still do brochures and leaflets, but they don't receive their information that way. So you've got to really be clever about how you get your information across to people, whether it's through Reddit or Twitter or whatever, Facebook, or whatever mechanisms they receive it. You've got to make sure that you get those messages to the people that matter it, and as early as possible. And you've got to support NGOs. Because I'm very privileged. I'm patron of 11 NGOs. All of them are women-led. And they're all doing phenomenal work. I'm trying to get them to be a coalition. I'm trying to get them to work together because they spend so much of their time bidding for funds. You recognize that. And they may not have the capacity and capability to do that. We need to support them. I had a meeting with a former Home Secretary months ago about this issue and said, look, if you have to ask people to fill in a 30-page business case to get funds, anybody that can do so shouldn't get the funds. They've got plenty of time on their hands. Yeah? That you should actually be identifying people who are doing the work and providing support. And NGOs will tell you that very often they too are attacked. They too are attacked. Their tires are slashed. Their buildings. If you go to Southall Black Sisters in West London, I'm not joking, I've been to MI5 and MI6 and God knows, it's harder to get into Southall Black Sisters than it is to get into security services. Because they are being threatened non-stop by members of the community who would rather they didn't exist. They're still there 30 years later. So you need to provide support to NGOs. You've got to give them, who are working in this area, tons of support where you can. I'll leave really with my final story, which is two of which. One is I mentioned Banaz Mahmood to you. It's not in the film, it's not in the documentary, but I said earlier on, the people who loved her couldn't give a toss about her, which is why they killed her. So me and an NGO had to bury her. It was not in my job description that I bury victims of murder. But who else was going to? Who else was going to remember her? Who else is going to remember and support her? 25 plus years ago, I met a woman at an event not unlike this one, and I noticed that she had her wedding ring not on her wedding finger, but on the opposite finger of her hand. And I said to her, why do you have your wedding ring on the wrong finger? And she said, it's because they forced me to marry the wrong man. I looked at her and I thought, she now has a life of hopelessness, of despair, of daily rape, of child protection issues, suicide, homicide, everything horrible that can happen. But that was all she could do in terms of protest. Not that she didn't have a voice, it's because we as authorities weren't listening. And I made it my responsibility to listen. Thank you very much indeed.